All right, well, thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I was invited to talk about a flood management initiative that we have underway. So I'll just give you a little bit of an overview, starting with, I'm going to scroll ahead. I know you've got a number of things on your agenda. Just a couple seconds on Fraser Basin Council. I think many of you are familiar with us. We're a not-for-profit, non-governmental organization working on a wide range of sustainability issues. Particularly, we are invited to play a facilitation role where there is no single lead agency responsible. So flood management is one of those, where there's a range of roles across local governments, provincial agencies, federal departments, and other organizations. So there is no single lead, so we're well situated to be that facilitator and bring together the different interests and jurisdictions and perspectives to work on some of these challenging issues. And we work across British Columbia, but have a focus on the Fraser Basin, and with an emphasis in the Lower Mainland when it comes to our flood management program. So certainly flooding is a sustainability issue. We describe sustainability as social well-being supported by a vibrant economy and sustained by a healthy environment. And there are really significant social, economic, and environmental impacts when it comes to a flood event. And flooding does occur annually in British Columbia in one or more communities. We've been quite fortunate in the Lower Mainland to not have any significant Fraser floods, but there have been a number of flood events, coastal storm surge events, and other tributaries to the Fraser. And I won't scroll through these, but just some examples of the kinds of impacts to public and private property, critical infrastructure. A lot of the best agricultural land is not surprisingly in the river valley, so i.e. in the floodplain. And in the Lower Fraser, the various parts of the floodplain include over 300,000 people living in the floodplain, quite a large number of homes and businesses. But when it comes to the critical infrastructure, a lot of our transportation corridors, rail lines, highways, Port Metro Vancouver, YVR, a lot of our energy corridors as well, oil and gas pipelines, hydroelectric corridors, substations are in the floodplain. And that is really significant because when those are impacted or disrupted or damaged or destroyed by a flood event, it can really cause a ripple effect, impacting other infrastructure and impacting other people that might be on high ground and not directly flooded themselves, but certainly impacted. So there's a real case for an integrated response across all of the different infrastructure operators and owners, as well as the different government jurisdictions. A little bit about climate change. The current numbers and the actual numbers not really, we don't need to get hung up on that right now, but the estimate is a projected sea level rise of approximately 1 meter by the year 2100. And so certainly there's a concern about increasing flood risk from the ocean due to sea level rise, but also questions around, well, what does climate change mean in terms of storm surge events or river flooding? What does it mean in the hydrology of the Fraser River Basin or some of the tributary rivers? And what does it mean in terms of extreme rainfall events? And we're not as clear about that. On coastal systems, we can expect more frequent and higher magnitude flood events, but we're really uncertain around what does this mean for flood risk along the Fraser River. So a recent study that the provincial government commissioned put together an estimate of the cost of adapting to sea level rise and storm surge events on the coast downstream of the Port Mann Bridge, and that cost estimate was about $9.5 million. That did include some seismic upgrades on a couple of sites, but a pretty significant number, and certainly got a lot of attention in December when that report was released. And so the costs are significant, but we think manageable. We've got some time to sort of catch up with and adapt to sea level rise. And then also in December, there were the king tide events and some storm surge events that impacted Vancouver, West Vancouver, and other parts of coastal Lower Mainland. So it was one of those cases where we had this sort of theoretical, there's a significant cost here, and then some real observations of what this could look like going forward. So I'm going to pause on those issues for now, just briefly mention our Joint Program Committee for Integrated Flood Hazard Management, what I'll refer to as the JPC. This was established in 1998, and it's one of those committees where we bring together the different municipalities, regional districts, provincial and federal agencies, and other organizations with interests and roles and responsibilities around flood management. It has served as a forum to share information, to bring common issues of concern, and also to pool resources to take on projects that would benefit the multiple organizations. And the Lower Fraser hydraulic model is one example that was initiated at and overseen by the Joint Program Committee. So we had I'll just back up a little bit to June of 2011 when the province released climate change adaptation guidelines for sea dikes and coastal flood hazard land use. Then the cost of adaptation report that I mentioned, that report coincidentally was released on the day of a meeting of our Joint Program Committee, and there's a lot of media interest and a lot of phones were ringing off the hook and people coming in and out of the meeting trying to field media queries. And it was felt that this is a significant issue and we need to start thinking about how we're going to adapt and respond to sea level rise, storm surge, and to get ahead of those costs of adaptation. And then there's more recent events in Toronto, Calgary, the OECD report that indicated Vancouver as a significantly vulnerable community on a global scale. I assume they mean Metro Vancouver, but I haven't looked into the details on that. So the Joint Program Committee agreed we should do something about this. We're not sure what. So we secured some funding and were commissioned by Metro Vancouver, Natural Resources Canada, and the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations to initiate some work, prepare a business plan, explore interest in taking a regional approach to this. And if there was interest and we could clarify the value of that, scope out what a collaborative and regional flood management effort would look like. So this year, January through September, we've done a lot of outreach and engagement, listening to communities, what are their issues, concerns, priorities. Is there merit in taking a regional approach and strengthening flood management in the Lower Mainland? We did that through a survey and some follow-up one-on-one meetings and then a couple of conversations through our Joint Program Committee. So what came out of this is a business plan. We're near completion of that, still open to receiving feedback and input on that. But the overall goal is to strengthen flood hazard management policies and practices and infrastructure to reduce risk and vulnerability over the long run. And to do that by enhancing the exchange of information, filling some information gaps, enhancing opportunities for coordination and collaboration, but avoiding duplication. Lots of individual municipalities are doing lots of great work, and this is not intended to duplicate that, but fill some gaps where it makes sense in a way that benefits the region. So the geographic scope, while this was triggered by the cost of adaptation report, we're interested in looking at a range of flood risks from Hope to Richmond, and from the U.S. border up to and including the District of Squamish. We're interested in looking not only at sea level rise and storm surge, but also river flooding. And we're interested in looking both at structural and non-structural approaches to flood management. So traditional diking and bank protection, erosion protection structures, as well as land use decisions and floodproofing practices. And really what came out of this was the recommendation focused on improving our technical information, and we need to improve that in sort of three areas that would lead to the development of a strategy. One is to get a better handle on the status of current management conditions. Two is to better understand a range of flood hazards and risks. And then three, to do an assessment or an evaluation of best practices and management options. And then all those sort of three areas of work would then inform the development and implementation of the strategy over time. So just a few highlights of feedback. One is to initially a more ambitious program was proposed, a 4-year multi-million-dollar program, and it was recommended, well, focus on some early wins, a couple strategic projects that would benefit multiple communities and organizations in the region. Scale that phase 1 in terms of a more manageable budget, and then test the value of this and evaluate after phase 1 and see if there was merit in proceeding with more additional work and a more comprehensive look at this issue. But do keep that longer term vision in sight. We recognize that the issue will not be resolved with a couple specific one-off projects, so select those in a way that we can build upon that knowledge base in the future. Also, in terms of recommendations, use existing mechanisms. So it was recommended to take the existing Joint Program Committee, where we've got some really effective working relationships, pretty broad representation, but not fully inclusive, and enhance that model. Bring in some other organizations. Include, for example, additional municipalities. So with historically we focused on the Fraser, so there's been no representation from North Vancouver or West Vancouver. So involve some of those other communities. Involve some other non-government interests in the region that may not have jurisdiction, but certainly have some vulnerability. I'll use Port Metro Vancouver and YVR as just a couple of examples. So again, looking at phase 1 over the next 2 years, starting January, hopefully, and rolling out to December of 2015. Look at a phase 1 budget of approximately $500,000 over 2 years, and that would be cost shared among local, provincial, federal agencies, as well as some of those other regional entities in the Lower Mainland. Focus on 3 priority technical projects, and that would be delivered with this budget, as well as the project management and coordination support. So the 3 priorities that have emerged in this process, one is to look at projected water levels for multiple flood scenarios, both different river flows, different degrees of sea level rise, and storm surge scenarios. We've got a good handle on the Fraser River design flood and the 1 in 200 year storm surge, but if we're going to inform, say, a more risk-based approach to management, we need to look at a wider range of flood scenarios. Second is to look at a region-wide analysis of flood risk and vulnerability. What are the impacts and consequences and costs of a catastrophic flood in the Lower Mainland? Both direct flood damages, but also impacts on economic activity due to disruption of infrastructure and say, shutting down the port for a month or more. What does that mean in terms of the economic activity? And then thirdly, we undertake a more complete assessment of current conditions, both in terms of flood protection works, but also the effectiveness of floodproofing policies and floodplain bylaws and floodplain management decisions. So this is where we see this initiative going over the next couple of months. Finalize the business plan, refine those phase 1 priorities, flesh out the details of what those look like so we can get to clear terms of reference, issue RFPs, retain consulting engineers or planners to do that work, and simultaneously build support and secure the funding so we can then move into an implementation phase starting January. And then we would periodically report on progress out to the JPC and partner organizations and others as the work is being undertaken, and then do a review as we approach the end of that phase 1, and that would then inform additional work.